Okay, Unit 3, Populations, Module 18, Human Population Dynamics and the Demographic Transition. So this is our last module in Unit 3. The demographic parameters discussed earlier in this unit, such as crude birth rate and death rates, infant mortality, and total fertility rates, have all interrelated impacts on human population dynamics. These population changes do have certain recognizable patterns and in some cases can be modeled and described with demographic transition model. This model illustrates the difference between countries as they transition from one stage of economic development to another. Our learning goals today are explain what factors lead to population growth and decline, calculate the doubling times using the rule of 70, describe the demographic transitions, and explain how population and consumption interact to influence the environment. So, first standard, explain what factors lead to population growth and decline. Population growth and consumption are two of the biggest drivers of environmental change. That makes sense. As your population grows, you're going to need more materials to support your population, such as food or water or land to grow that food or trees to build houses, etc. Okay, you can put two and two together on how those things are related. The United States has typically been the biggest consumer of goods and producers of pollutants, but China and other nations such as India are rapidly gaining in both areas because their populations are growing rapidly. So, again, they're using more resources, they're consuming more goods, and unfortunately, as a result, they also are polluting more. Something else that China has done in the past is the one child policy. So, you were only allowed to have one child if it was a male, and if it was a female, you could have another child that would be a male. But after that, they cut you off, and so they were rewarding families that limited themselves to one child while imposing taxes and wage garnishments, as well as abortion and forced sterilizations on couples that kept having children, to try to limit their population growth, as well as some other cultural reasons, and to limit their consumption of goods and resources. The total fertility rate from 1970 in China went from 6.3 to 1.5, although some attribute this shift to increase in economic prosperity, and we'll see how your economic prosperity decreases your population change. So there are some general factors that are considered to contribute to population growth and decline. So a high crude birth rate obviously would make your population bigger. Total fertility rate being high, so more opportunities for women to have children. Low infant mortality rate. Early marriage, because the early people get married, the more likely they're going to have kids sooner. Lack of access to family planning or birth control. So some of our poorer nations aren't going to have the same access as we do in the United States to clinics that would give us birth control or condoms, etc. Access to adequate nutrition and low overall death rate. Those are all things that are going to help your population grow. Now, decline is a low crude birth rate, so we're not having that many children. If we are having children, it's later in life, so we're not having as many. Our infants are not living very long. We're not getting married as early and having kids. We do have access to family planning, access to adequate nutrition. Okay, so we are uh, being able to figure out what nutritional things we need, and that's keeping us from having more children. We'll explain that a little bit more. And then a high overall death rate. Okay, those keep your populations declining. One big thing they point out in the book is urban populations are growing globally, with more than 50%, 56% of the world living in urban areas and 70% just for North America. So why is that important? Well, that's important because things are becoming more centralized, and that means that you're probably going to have better access to healthcare if you're not out in the middle of nowhere and might not have the resources to get to town. It also means that we're probably using more resources like gasoline or energy to keep our lights on and things like that, and more infrastructure because we're moving more into big cities and less out, and we're being less in rural areas. So as you can see, from the 1950s to 2020, so 70 years difference, the urban population and percentage in Africa was below even probably a quarter of their percent to almost 30 or 40%. And then the same thing with, North America has probably been the least amount of change, going from 50% to just below 75%. Okay, we're on our second standard, so calculating double times using the rule of 70. So in order to characterize how fast a population grows, the doubling time can be calculated. So the doubling time is just how long it takes for the population to double. It's just that simple. This can be approximated by a mathematical equation using statistical rule of 70, or dividing the number 70 by the percentage growth rate. So doubling time in years equals 70 divided by the growth rate expressed as a percentage. So therefore, the population growing at 2% each year will increase. The population will double in 35 years. So if the United States had a population growth of 2% a year, we figured out that if we would take 70 divided by the growth rate of 2%, that means our population doubles every 35 years. So we're going to go over this more in class on Monday and Tuesday. But for examples, you can see the do the math section in your textbook, as well as we'll be doing that on Monday. Okay, describe demographic transition. So this is a graph that can be pretty confusing if you don't know what you're looking at. So it says the theory of demographic transitions tracks how a country moves from high to low birth and death rates as the development occurs and the country moves from pre-industrial to an industrial economic system. So stage one, pre-industrial, slow population growth. So you see our population is pretty low, and that's because we have a high death rate and a high birth rate, so they're starting to kind of cancel each other out. If we go to industrializing, we see a pretty rapid growth. We start to hit that exponential curve. Our birth rates are pretty much staying the same throughout this period, falling off a little bit, but our death rates are falling quite a bit. Okay. And then we're going to reach our stable population growth. So we're kind of getting towards the top of that exponential curve. We're hitting that J or that S. And our birth rates are falling because we don't need as many children to work in our fields or cut wood for our family, etc., because we're moving more towards urbanization, which is electricity, etc., etc. And so we can see as the population size goes up, our birth rate and death rate tend to fall. So people are living longer, but we don't need to have as many children, etc., etc. So it kind of balances itself out. So in stage one, population growth is slowed due to many factors. So looking at the beginning part of this graph right here, we can see that our birth rate and our death rate are both high. Life expectancy is not very long. Child and infant mortality are high, and children are needed to work for the workforce and to care for the elderly. So back in the day, you had children because the more children you had, the more likely that you'd have one of them survive to adulthood and be able to take care of you when you're old, as well as the more children you had, the more free labor you had to work on your farm or work in the workforce and bring money home for bills. So that's pre-industry. So your farming communities or villages that do not have industry like manufacturing, etc. Stage two. So we're looking in kind of in the middle towards the beginning. So the population growth is rapid due to high birth rates with a dropping death rate. So usually that means our medical care is improved. We've needed to improve our drinking water because more people are living on it. And our education systems and birth controls are slow to form, so birth rates still remain high. So we're overall healthier as a community, but we haven't quite figured out the birth control. So we're still having lots of kids, but people are also living longer, which is why we see this big exponential curve. Stage three, so the population growth begins to stabilize. So we have higher income families, so we don't need as many free labor children to work, as well as we can afford medical care in our later life. So we don't need, again, free child labor to take care of us when they're old. Education becomes more of a priority. So people are pushing off getting pregnant and having kids because they're focused on school. So going to college or secondary or post-secondary education. And then our birth and death rates begin to equalize again. So we're not having as many births, but also not as many people are dying. So it kind of balances out. And then finally, in stage 4, population growth starts to actually decline or level off. So we have higher affluence and economic prosperity. Children may become an undesirable financial burden. Women choose to remain in school and the workforce longer before childbearing, and there are more older people than younger people in the population. So that's kind of where the United States is at right now. So the stats on raising a kid is like $250,000 to raise them from 0 to 17 years old, which is a lot of money. Okay, when you think that like the average teacher's salary in Missouri is under 50. Okay, so that's a lot. So they're not having children because of the economic problems. We're also more concerned about advancing ourselves in our career, and so women are waiting longer to get married and have kids. And then we have a lot more older people, such as our boomer generation, outnumbers a lot of our younger kiddos by a pretty substantial amount. So then finally, our fourth standard explain how population and consumption interact to influence the environment. Both population size and the amount of resources each person uses are factors to determine the impact of humans on Earth. Growth of crops, uses of energy and water and mineral resources, but as populations advance, consumption of meat grows. So the crops are then used to feed farm animals rather than a direct food source. Developed nations comprise about 1.3 billion, and developing nations are around 6.5 billion. And those in developed nations, affluence goes up and the resources grow as well. This is pretty interesting. So if you think about a trophic pyramid, and so meat is kind of the second or the third trophic, and we tend to eat more meat as our society grows, which is interesting thought process because we know that as we go up the trophic pyramid, we only keep about 10% of the energy each time. And so if we all continue to just eat plants right here, we would actually use a lot less farmland because our farm crops that we're growing right now just go to the people and not to the animals and then to the people. So we would have more energy consumed. So that is one of the arguments that vegetarians try to make, and it's a pretty decent one. What's kind of nice around this, though, is that as these developing countries develop, it means, in theory, their populations will start to go down or stabilize, which means we may not have to produce as much resources, even though our resources will grow, the populations will fall. So developed nations are almost a sixth of what they are for developing nations. So hopefully that means as they kind of develop and move forward, our resource consumption will hopefully go down. So looking at these charts right here, you can see human population size. China and India are in developing countries still, believe it or not. So they do have some big cities, but especially India is still developing to be kind of where the United States is right now. And then China, most of China is pretty well underdeveloped. And so whenever these countries start to develop, hopefully their populations kind of level off. And then the population growth is specific to developing nations and all developed nations. So developed countries, only about 1 billion people live in those countries. So that would be, United States, that would be Russia, and that would be Japan, right? And those would pretty well, are good comparisons to each other in this graph. And then these underdeveloped countries or countries that are developing, they just need more folks to run things. That's why they have big populations, because it's more hands equals less work. Okay, a conceptual representation of the three major factors that influence the environmental impacts is called the IPAT equation or IPAT equation. This is not an actual math equation, so breathe a little easier, but it's one that can show the increase in these factors will increase the impact of the population. So our impact equals our population times our affluence times our technology. So as the factors As these factors of population, affluence, and technology increase, the overall impact increases. So the more people that get fancier need more technology, which means we're going to have a greater impact. And so, thinking about this, like everyone has a cell phone nowadays. And so cell phones are actually pretty harsh on the environment as far as the minerals it takes to create them, the gold that are in the chips that make them run on, make the computer run inside there, the plastic that we're using and throwing away, the glass and the technology we're using to build those things. All of those things are very harmful on the environment, but you can't find too many people that don't have a cell phone or cars. Okay, it's and especially in rural Missouri where you pretty much need a car to get anywhere. The more people are, that's going to become a standard of living for them. Nobody's not going to have a car because it means freedom. But cars are also very expensive on the environment. So they are a ton of metal. We need right now a ton of gasoline, right? So all of those things we have to pull from somewhere, and unfortunately, it is the earth. So again, as our population grows and we get more developed, our effluency grows, and then the more our effluency grows, typically the more technological advances we're trying to make, which means our standard of living goes up, which unfortunately is a little bit harder on the environment. That is your module 18. Let me know if you have any questions.